February 2022, Russia launched what appears to be a rather large invasion towards the Ukraine. What's the history behind that? Where's it going? And what are the solutions going to be? I'm joined today on Lokmedia once again by Sylvana Dillon and, of course, Steve Headley. Welcome, both of you. And let's have your point of view. Sal, first of all, 2022, it's not so long ago, but it's going on a bit.
Yeah, there's a whole background to this that earlier on, around about, I think, 2012, there was an elected president in Ukraine, and then the US and its allies were able to orchestrate his overthrow by starting a movement within there. As they do, they create civil unrest and brought somebody who's more favorable to the US and their allied interests. So a democratically elected president was overthrown. He had to go to the US, to Russia. And not only that, there was an agreement a long time ago when the Warsaw Pact was dismantled. And the NATO Pact was supposed to be dismantled as well, the NATO countries. But they didn't fulfill their responsibility. Instead, they kept expanding NATO more and more towards Russia again, as if an effort to encircle Russia. And that really put Russia under a bit of threat. Also, military exercises carried along the Russian border, and Russia felt insecure with the expansion of NATO in its neighborhood, and hence invaded Ukraine in order to put a stop to that kind of threat. That's their viewpoint.
Well, okay, I think we've got to go back a little bit further. If we dip back to, say, 2014, for example, where hostilities between the two countries became evident, more or less on the world stage, or rather, should we say, the Western media decided that they'd have a little closer look at it. And obviously, it does go further back than this. So, Steve, obviously, this involved people who were formerly part of what is now known as Russia, the USSR. And obviously there were problems over there, and clearly they were not getting resolved. Now, obviously, this would have meant that people working and in their unions over there as well, they were getting affected. They were getting treated differently, weren't they? What sort of stories or what sort of impression did you get was going on between people who were obviously of Russian origin and those who were more akin to holding on to what they want to be a Ukrainian origin? Where did that come about, and why was there a difference between these two classes of people?
Yeah, well, I think Sylvander explained it quite well. I mean, I think in 2014 we had a coup that was organized and financed by the United States and other European powers. And I'm not going to put any shine on that government. It was a government of oligarchs who were pro-Russian, and they were overthrown by a gang of oligarchs who were pro-Western. And that was simply it. But America, as it seems to be doing more and more, picks and chooses which elections it's going to recognize as fair and which elections it's not. So that was the beginning of the war. I think that was the beginning of the process that led to the war. And then we had the Ukrainian government systematically discriminating against Russian speakers. They were banning Russian speakers in school, and some of the provinces in Donetsk and Lugansk were predominantly Russian speaking, and there a lot of miners and industrial workers had gone from Russia to those provinces. So not only were they Russian speaking, but there were a lot of Russians, first generation Russians living there. So that exacerbated the process, and then we had the annexation of Crimea, and so Russia annexed Crimea, and then we had what happened around Donetsk, Donbass, and Lugansk, and we had Russia after a period of time annexing them as well and making them, as they saw it, part of Russia. So we've got a very complicated situation, but there's no doubt. I mean, there's no doubt that Russia invaded the Ukraine. That's just not. I don't even think there's a debate about that. And I think the reason why we're discussing this tonight, and it's such an important issue, is the amazing about turn that the American government have performed under Donald Trump. And I think people will look back at this in history as one of the sort of defining moments, really, where any sort of international idea of liberalism that countries should cooperate, uh, and perhaps even NATO, the military alliance of NATO, were put under severe pressure, if not ended. I think this is a momentous period in history. I think the European Union, the imperialist powers in the European Union recognize this, and under the leadership of France and Germany are now trying to scramble together to see how they can support the Ukraine if this war continues. But the United States, and I think this is the thing that we all have to recognize. Up until this point, no matter how bloodthirsty American imperialism and capitalism was, it wore the mask that it was doing all these deeds in some greater good, some good for human rights. And Trump has just ripped that mask off. I mean, we have now the very ugly, scarred face of capitalism, and everything is transactional. He's even said to Zelensky that if he wants to continue getting arms from the United States, he's going to have to give him mineral rights in Ukraine. I just think that these are momentous times. I'd never actually heard any U.S. president being so blatant in public before, and making these sort of claims. But I think it will backfire badly on them.
Yeah, it's very interesting what Steve and what David mentioned. But first of all, why do people feel disillusioned in Ukraine that gave the possibility for the US to have a coup there? Is because ever since the abandonment of the principle, because in the USSR, you had the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, then you had the various regions, even Ukraine, Kazakhstan and all that. And the understanding between them was anything that was common to the Union of Soviet USSR was handled commonly. And the rest was more like a family, that everybody had to have the right of self-determination, had autonomy, and the economic interests were looked after. So there was more like a family, equality. And once that principle was violated with the coming I would say, Khrushchev. Soon after that, you find the Hungarian uprising, you have the Czech uprising against the very system of which they were a part of or supportive of each other. And that means there was disillusionment there as well. And the cause of that was the abandonment of the fundamental principle that when you're like a Union of Soviet Socialist Republics or any country that has a revolution with different nationalities there, they also have to have their autonomy and their economic interests looked, and not one major power start taking advantage of the others. And gradually that led to the erosion of bureaucracy and other things, the erosion of socialism and collapse of the Soviet Socialist Republics, and disintegration even, which gave an opportunity for US hegemony to emerge and do what they did in Ukraine. That this was a whole part of a plan. If we looked at Kissinger and the Nixon visit during the Vietnam War, a similar thing existed. That US wanted to create a division between the USSR and China, and Nixon even visited China at that time. And the similar thing is what they're trying to do is China is a fundamental issue here, why Trump is behaving like that. He sees China as the biggest threat in terms of economic, in terms of competition. He wants to isolate China. And obviously, they all wanted to weaken Russia. And similarly, what's happening in the Middle East is also linked to the whole equation of US being a unipolar power, US hegemony being threatened, and the weakening Russia. And main thing is also US wants to focus in its competition of tariffs, and perhaps, unfortunately, hope not, even a military war later on. Hope it doesn't happen. So these are inter-imperialist contradictions which are sharpening. And Steve mentioned about oligarchs. Yes, it's true that there are oligarchs in all countries which have abandoned even socialism. But at the same time, the policy is the encirclement or containment of China and weakening of Russia, and also control of the Middle East, and that is giving rise to the problems in Gaza, as well as the topic we're discussing, Ukraine.
Well, that's very fascinating, Nice, because actually lent a little bit more than what I was going to imagine you were going to say. That's very, very depthy, because prima facie, what Steve said was quite fascinating. We're surprised. I think we're all quite surprised about the way this is turning around. It's like being tossed around on the ocean, isn't it? If you look at it from the point of view, perhaps, of the members of the public who are trying to make some sense of this, because they're the ones that are going to be garner for votes, aren't they? How do they make sense out of this? Now, if you look at the way it went with the Ukraine, Zelensky was a populist character. I mean, he was a TV comedian, and he was obviously put in place and encouraged because he had that populist appeal. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? Let's have a look at the other person we're talking about, Donald Trump. Now, The Apprentice over there, amongst other things. He did a lot of other TV shows. Very, very populist. He went for populist opinions. However, what I would argue about Trump, for example, that makes him a little bit different is he'll criticize someone. On the face of it, you'll think that person's dead in the water, and then you'll go, I'll look forward to meeting the Prime Minister shortly. And you think, well, what's going on here? They are using sound bites to try to sway and push things around a bit. I think they're stirring around rather a lot. Got to dig a bit deeper and see what it really is all about. I think, absolutely, like you say, Steve, it's straight into the old minerals, isn't it? What have you got for me, mate? I'll be nice to you. And quite frankly, I think that's the way we look at it. But from a public point of view, from a media perspective, they're playing the media a lot. They're trying to say, look at this, we've got a real gung-ho president here. He's going to make America great again. Well, they've been great many times, and it's been a great deal of trouble around the world from the way they perform. So these are really worrying times, I think, when someone can make such sideswipe comments and then turn on the penny. Yeah. That's the concern, isn't it? Now, Putin, on the other hand, I look at he does come across as someone who's much more of a steady hand. He's progressively continuing. He's surely got, he's got battles on his own front himself. That there's going to be dissent amongst the ranks with him as well. You can be sure there will be other opinions. However, it is very unifying, which is a little bit different than the other two countries involved. And I think, will we be seeing something from Russia? And as for China, well, they've definitely got a consideration regarding what's going on, and they're quiet. What are they going to use? What's going to be their magic wand? I'm kind of curious about that. Steve, what do you think they may do?
With me, I think Trump is just a front man. I think there is the MAGA movement is being controlled by American oligarchs and by, ironically, the deep state in America that Trump tries to criticize. And I think they do recognize, as Sylvander said, that China is the economy and it's going to eclipse them within 10 years. China is predicted by 2030 to be a bigger economy than America. Now, they're not bothered about Russia. Russia have nuclear weapons. They've got a sizable army. But that army has been fought to a standstill by the Ukrainians with NATO support. That army is not going to take over Europe, and Russia is not going to become an economic superpower. So I think the MAGA strategists, whoever are pulling Trump's strings, have decided that they do want to make America economically great again. They do want to be the hegemon, and they have to knock China out of the equation. So that's why they pivoted towards Russia. They are pivoting towards Russia to try to get Russia on side. Now, I don't think Putin is that naive. I don't think that Putin will see this ruse over for anything other than it is, which is a maneuver from Trump to split him from China. And I think Putin knows that Russia's interest lies in the long term with their neighbor, which is China, rather than the US, which seems to be completely split down the middle. I mean, if you look at the voting system, the American Electoral College gave Trump the verdict of the election massively, but the voting was much closer. It was in the single millions. I mean, 3 or 4 million of a difference between both both of the candidates, and the Democrats had a very weak candidate who was seen as complicit in genocide. We have a lot of different arguments about that, but I think that what do China do? And I think that what China are doing is just playing the long game. I think they're just going to continue to build their economy. I don't think that they're going to be drawn into a battle around Taipei and the Republic of China, as it was always known, which we now call Taiwan. Proper name is Taipei. Taiwan's just one of the islands. And I think that the name of that country that they call themselves since the Chinese Civil War is still the Republic of China. And up until, a couple of years ago, they considered themselves the legitimate government of the whole of China. There was never any separatist movement. So I think this separatist movement, again, is being fed by elements in the United States because they want to destroy China economically. And what better way to destroy China economically than get them into some long-running war with Taipei and drain them economically and militarily. So I think China, we wait and see what's going to happen. But I think that the Russians and the Chinese are not so naive that a blunderbuss like Trump's going to come in and drive some sort of separation or long-term separation between them.
You're quite right, Steve. Putin's not that naive. And also with the strong alliance of BRICS, Brazil, India, China, Russia, and so many countries joining, is becoming a very big economic power. And nearly half the world's population being involved in that. So you're becoming a multipolar world, and that's what's really threatening. And also they want to trade their own currencies rather than the US dollar. So behind all these things happening is the fear the US says that it's gradually a declining power. And therefore, he's talking about making America great again. But in whose interest? Interest of the working class or interest of the monopoly capitalists there? Now, it doesn't matter Democrats in power or whether Republicans, they all represent the interests of the big capitalists there, but they have different approaches. As Steve mentioned, liberal democracy versus quite outright right wing. And this is what Hitler did in Germany, that those who believed in liberal democracy, the Christian Democrats and other parties gradually were shifted to the side, and the right wing emerged, and Hitler used the phrases like national socialism, but the interest of big industry, in the interest of big oligarchs, and not in the interest of working class. But the working class were made to sacrifice their labor, their hard effort, and Germany did become a very powerful country again. But the interest of the big oligarchs went even to war because of the growing conflict between the powerful Germany and the other imperialist countries. So we're finding a similar thing happening again, that the inter-imperialist contradictions are sharpening, especially between the US being threatened by China and BRICS. And we are facing a very serious danger in world history on the eve of perhaps a third world war. And the only forces we can rely upon is the working class of each country, the trade union movements in each country, who stand in solidarity against war, against what's happening in Gaza, against what's the encirclement of even China. Can you imagine Russia was not just fighting Ukraine in this case, although we're saying it invaded Ukraine, but it was fighting Europe and the whole US bloc with the amount of money through in, the weapons and the satellite navigation they're giving, and even some of the presence of their troops. This is a very inter-imperialist conflict, or more so, the USA, Germany, and their allies trying to destroy Russia. So imagine if they took over Russia, how many big resources, how much big land would be at their disposal. And these are hungry hyenas. And what Trump is doing is also like one of the hyenas, that he's trying to negotiate what he can get for America from the spoils, what's happening in Ukraine, such as the minerals, 50%. He's trying to get over there. So behind that is not the interest of the American people. It's a continuation of the same policy of controlling the labor and resources and destroying countries and then trying to get contracts and make money out of it. The continuation of the policy of when they wanted to destroy Iraq, Libya, Syria, Sudan. It's all aimed in the same purpose of US hegemony and trying to remain the superpower and the policeman in those areas and exploiter of the cheap labor and resources, but they are now fighting each other. The capitalists within Europe and the capitalists within America have different approaches. And even between the European capitalists and those in the USA, the contradictions are sharpening, which is reflecting on the shift that's taking place between their relationship as well.
Well, look, that's very interesting, but I want to bring something else into the mix now. Let's get on with, if you look at what Trump says, he's a businessman and he's the president, and that kind of goes hand in glove, doesn't it? Now, if you recall, when Margaret Thatcher had some difficulties, just then the Falklands popped up for her. Now, look what Starmer's talking about. He's talking about putting boots on the ground over there. Well, obviously, I think a lot of us would perceive that as perhaps a very weak Prime Minister to say such a thing. We're asking ourselves, well, why would you suddenly decide that now when the whole thing's still in play? Steve, first of all, what do you make of the idea that he's suggesting conscription?
Look, yeah, it just kind of mopping up from what we said on the last question. I think the ruling class in America is split down the middle. I think that there are still those who want to pursue a liberal agenda. There's some who want to pursue a nakedly imperialist agenda, and I think the European leaders are on the side of those who want to pursue a liberal agenda. It's still capitalist, it's still exploitative, but it pretends not to be. The armed forces in Europe come nowhere near to the armed forces of America. And I think it's the damage that Trump has done to his own alliance is phenomenal. I think he's alienated France, Germany, Britain even. And when you've got Kemi Badenoch, for goodness sake, criticizing Trump, I think that there's serious splits there in that alliance, which has been there since the end of the Second World War, that NATO alliance. But I think that when we look at the sort of definitions of fascism, Mussolini said that fascism is corporatism. Okay, it's corporatism. When you have got the state and big corporations working hand in hand, and almost there's no space between them. And I think that's what Trump is outrightly and blatantly installed in America. When you've got the oligarchs like Elon Musk running around cutting programs, welfare programs, and government programs in the States, and blatantly profiteering from it. I think we're now seeing the merging of corporations and governments in the United States. So I don't think it's too strong a word to see we're having the emergence of fascism in the United States. I don't think that's I think it's just going to be a historical fact that is happening. What Europe does about it, I don't know. I think the people in this country have been told that welcome the Ukrainians with open arms, throw open your spare room. And now all of a sudden, Zelensky's a dictator who started a war. I think they've been caught on the hop, and whether they can turn that public perception around after feeding it for 3 years, I'm not sure they can. I don't think they can just suddenly abandon the Ukraine. And I don't think it's in the national interests or the European Union interests to do that either. The capitalist class in those countries, it's not in their interests to have a powerful Russia on the borders and sort of back in the game, if you like. I'm quite sure they would have liked to have seen Russia dissected into smaller states. But yeah, I think we're in very interesting times. I can't see anybody in this country, even the sort of most crazy nationalist in this country, wanting to go off and die in the Ukraine. I really can't see it. And I think that if they bring in conscription to try to solve that problem, there will be mass desertions and we're going to see mass protests on the streets. People in this country may have sympathy with the Ukrainians. It's been a well-nurtured sympathy and a well sort of fed sympathy from our government. But I don't think that outside of a few lunatics that people will want to go and die in the Ukraine.
Steve, that's a very interesting point, and I'm glad you picked up on that the original point towards the end of that, which is a good point to bring it in. The the media's been out there doing exactly what the government wants it to do, which is to feed a specific narrative. Okay, and I don't think they even knew what that narrative really was once governments changed over, even though Starmer seems much more of the same. But I don't think they actually really know how that's going to play out. And I think it was a bit of an opening gambit on the part of Starmer to suggest boots on the ground, because he said some pretty stroppy things recently. He's been smashing. Like any left-wing journalist, for example, has really taken a good hiding. They've been arresting them on false pretenses. They punish them by just process, as opposed to the actual punishment at the end of it. So there's been a lot of subjugation of what would be the natural inclination of anyone who is a socialist to do or say something about it. Now people are thinking, well, I don't want to comment on it. And then in comes Starmer and starts saying what he thinks it should be. Now, they've pandered very, very much to quite far right attitudes, as you know yourself, whereby people have gone over to the Ukraine, former army officers and former squaddies as well, and they've gone out there, they've got themselves into trouble, and there's been a very sympathetic narrative played out in most of the papers that will give the story out. They're saying, oh, they've gone over there, they're fighting for them, they're concerned about things. And yeah, actually, these are what kind of fighters are they? They're not authorized by the government to go over there. They're not being told we want you to go over there. So they're playing on all of this, and I'm wondering, have they really measured what public opinion actually is about people that went over there? Because if you tell some people, they'll say, well, I wouldn't dream of going over into a situation like that. It's not that we're organizing anything over there at all. It's people have gone over there and they suddenly find they don't know what they're doing there. They get lost. There's been horrible stories of men who have have done tours in the army, for example, and they've gone over there, and then suddenly they're all on their own. There is no support there whatsoever. So do you think that might backfire if they really do suggest conscription?
Well, absolutely, David. Even Poland yesterday said they don't want to get involved by sending troops into Ukraine, and rests right next to Ukraine. And here's Rishi Sunak rushed immediately. Boris Johnson rushed immediately. Ukraine don't have a ceasefire. Keep fighting. We'll support you. We'll back you up. So Britain has been playing a very dangerous role, and Russia has already said that if there are troops there, sent there, they're going to treat it as a declaration of war, and they will attack them as well. So it's a very dangerous situation. But already the missiles have been fired into Russia, as Putin has mentioned. They cannot be fired without the intelligence, without the satellite information provided by the Western powers. So they're already involved in that battle themselves. And this is going to add more fuel to the fire, worsen the situation. And Keir Starmer is just rushing to the US to saying, look, let me be your poodle. And I think Trump might even push him back and say, no, I'll pick up some of the better poodle than you.
What do you think is going to happen if they do suggest such a thing? And the reason I say that is because Putin is on record as saying, if the UK gets involved, then he will definitely target the UK. He's going to consider it a declaration of war. And quite frankly, I think they're going to, it's quite disturbing. I mean, Putin does tend to do what he says. He's careful what he says, quite clearly, but he gets on with the business, doesn't he? He's not flapping around with things. And I think, what can people really do to assure themselves that this might not? How can they dissuade other people from considering such a thing?
I think there are kind of parallels with the First World War here. I think that the Labour Party in Britain are kind of playing the role of the Social Democrats in Germany just before World War One, and they were rallying people and whipping them into a patriotic fervour, And I think that this is the role that Starmer will be doing. And if you look at the way that the Social Democrats treated the press, their main organ was Forwards, which was a paper that workers read, and they were much more trusted by workers than the conservative and the far right in Germany. And I think that's the role that Starmer will be playing in Britain, and I think he will crack down. We've already seen, as you've mentioned, the crackdown on anti-war protesters here. And I think there will be, sorry, that's anti-war in Palestine, the war on Palestine, the genocide. And I think this legislation will be used against anti-war protesters here, because if this is serious, and they are trying to put British feet on the ground, British boots on the ground in the Ukraine, I think there's going to be an enormous backlash in this country, the likes of which we've probably never seen. Because I think that there are two things actually. First of all, people think it's nothing to do with Britain. This is nothing to do with Britain. It's a war between Russia and the Ukraine, and Russia's strategic objectives are very limited. They want parts of the Ukraine and Ukraine not to be in NATO. That's been explicit from the start. But secondly, I think that the attitude of Trump and people like that will be filtered into the right wing in this country. People like Farage will become far more prominent, and his ragtag sort of far right party is now polling nearly the same as the Tories and Labour in the polls. They're not a sort of fringe element anymore in that respect. So he could become a pole of attraction that says, well, we don't want a war either, and we could have this kind of bizarre situation where the far right are the ones that are coming out in the mainstream opposing the war.
Sorry, another factor that's coming up too is if we compare on the eve of the Second World War, rather the Big Depression that took place in 1928, they all know that we're heading off towards a severe economic crisis, and US owes a lot of money, so in debt is increasing. You mentioned about Nigel Farage. It's quite likely that people like Nigel Farage will become more promoted. Trump would prefer people like him, as he preferred Johnson. And he's also preferring the right wing in Germany and in France. So gradually we're seeing a shift from liberal democracy to more and more open fascism. And the reason behind that is going to be further suppression of the working class fighting this right. So we're fighting for our own rights, the working class interest in this country, as well as against war, and then more and more repression of that. So while it's true that Nigel Farage and the right wing will be against the war in Ukraine, but they will be carrying out more and more becoming fascist on the working class in their own countries because of the rising tide of struggle for their own interests, as well as opposition by the people of this country against what's happening abroad.
The thing is, what's going to be fueling it, and also what's also been laced up. I mean, we talk about the unions. Once again, I'd refer to Steve there. I'm quite well aware that there are certain people in the RMT union who have actually been out to the Donbass, and why and what's going on there, and are they tied into any of this? You have to wonder about why people do things, and look how it's all playing out at the moment. I can't see some people going back over there under the circumstances, but they're in the unions and they'll be able to make statements, however sincere they may be trying to make those statements. They do appear to be like puppets. So is this what we're going to see? Are we going to see a bit more of unions being allowed to get a bit more expression in the media because they're pulling the right narrative?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, the person who's looking at the RMT leadership at the minute is both has a record of campaigning for Donald Trump. He supported Donald Trump the first time round. I don't know what his attitude was the second time, and was very much a fan of Russia and in the Donbass. Now that's going to be very interesting because it is that going to be used as a voice for anti-war movement against the war in Russia? Will Stammer tolerate that? I've got my doubts if any trade union leaders will stand up against the government if they come to them, because outside of those of us in the north of Ireland and perhaps the miners' strike, None of these people have seen how ruthless the British state can actually be. So I think that the chances of trade union leaders ending up in jail is quite high if they oppose, if they effectively oppose, other than just getting on stages and saying this is terrible. If they try to organize workers not to be conscripted and a real anti-war movement and not just one through rhetoric, I think the government could crack down on them very, very heavily.
The person you're talking about, that's been a subject of our interest of recent times as well, actually. I mean, he's platforming out in solidarity with Palestinians. And yet, you know, he has his members out there in the Red Sea, has he not, Steve? Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because they could take instruction not to be participating, and yet I think he's found wanting at the moment concerning this. So will that not be held against him if he tries anything? Is it a way of muting the unions? Is this a way of muting them? I mean, if he actually becomes, for instance, a supreme power within that union, for example, which he could well be, then they've got someone they can mute reasonably easily, I suppose, if that's the case.
Well, I mean, I don't know about the machinations of the state, but all I can say is that all the unions have been an absolute disgrace in this country over Palestine. And we've mentioned this several times in our discussions. I think that, you know, these people have got an absolute brass neck. They get on platforms, they say how terrible the genocide is, what, you know, how they're fully supporting Palestinians. And in the case of the RMT leadership, they allow their members to be used in the Red Sea, not just attacking Yemen, but also having flights over Palestine and giving that information to Israel and America so they can bomb it, you know. So, yeah, there are big contradictions in the trade union movement. And no one outside of ourselves seem to want to talk about that. The Palestinian Solidarity Committee and other bodies, the anti-war movement in this country, are quite happy to platform these people and give them the chance to spout their hypocrisy. Now, whether that changes if there comes to blows between the West and Russia, or Europe and Russia, as it looks like now, that may change. I'm not sure, but I think if it does, the government will crack down very heavily on it.
I think the situation in Palestine isn't going to improve. There's no way Israel is going to give up their territories it's already captured. What's happened in Syria is also showing that they've also taken a part of a certain section of Syria. So they're going to try to have that control under Israel. This has been a plan for a long time to control the territory of Palestine, Syria, and this whole line of axis they've had, they're going to continue with that policy. They've overthrown the government in Syria, Libya, Sudan, and they're going to focus on Iran. And unfortunately, the Palestinian people are going to keep suffering as a part of this policy. And it's very important for the trade union movement, especially the rank and file, to build a mass movement in support of the Palestinian people's right of self-determination and for them to have their own land and have a just solution for them, as well as we want peace throughout the world. We don't want a war in Ukraine or between Ukraine and Russia or between China and US. And this has been this stand of the working class throughout the world, that we got to oppose the war, oppose racism, at the same time fight for our own rights, that they don't bring fascism in Britain and deny the workers the right to express solidarity, and we're going to fight against the legislation against the working class. So we get a whole challenge ahead, is to build a strong trade union movement, especially in the rank and file, on principled basis, in the interest of the working class of this country, and just solutions for people in other countries, and also solidarity with similar-minded trade unionists throughout the world.
Well, on that point, clearly, it dovetails once again into the fact that people really need to take what their occupation is very seriously regarding trade unions. They need to value them tremendously, because at the end of the proverbial day, if you don't take those actions, then all those opportunities are going to be gone. And those opportunities are going to be lost if people don't hold on to, number one, the values that they already have, that they were hard earned by the forefathers, but we need to earn more more opportunities as well, more rights. It's not a question about preserving what we have. We've actually got to fight hard to get extra additional rights in to protect against the deterioration of what's going on. So with that, Solinda Dillon, thank you very much indeed. Steve Headley, thank you very much indeed. And we'll look forward to something very interesting next time we join ourselves.
Well, thank you very much, David, for the opportunity to exchange views and opinions on such important topics. And thanks to Steve as well.
Thank you, guys. Bye.